Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to another episode of Insaaf Ki Baat. I'm your host Komal Dilshad, and today we have with us Sarah Belal, who's the founder and the executive director of Justice Project Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us and for taking out the time. Welcome to the podcast. I think I will start with the ever famous question of how did you end up founding JPP? What's the journey been like? What inspired you to do the work that you're doing?
I went to law school pretty late in my life. It wasn't something that I had planned to do. But when I did finally go to law school, my only interest was to do human rights. And that was very much confirmed my first semester at law school when I had to do contract law, and I realized this is never going to be what I like to do. When I came back to Pakistan, there wasn't like a clear path to what does human rights mean, because it's a very, very broad field. So I started working at a criminal law chamber. Actually, the first one, my first boss who gave me a chance in criminal law was Azam Nazir Tarar, who's now the law minister. And I was the first girl in his office back then. And I really, really, really liked practicing criminal law. It was challenging. You learned the tricks, you learned the trade. It gave me a platform to actually learn how to do trial work and other work. But then pretty soon I realized that I did not have much interest in representing wealthy individuals who had committed crimes, because those people could really get excellent legal assistance like my boss and like a bunch of other lawyers. But what I did see was there was many people in prison who had absolutely no money, and the time that you spend in prison and the amount of time and the sentence that you get is directly proportional to the legal aid or the lawyer that you have access to. So eventually at the request or at this advice so I work for another chamber. Actually, my mother got me to do civil law for just 3 months, and after the third month that I fell asleep on the book, the partner very politely told my mother, look, I really don't think it's for her. So I went back and I did some work for another nonprofit, and then my second mentor, Salman Chima, who's a very famous contract lawyer, a civil lawyer, he advised me he said, you're wasting your time. You pretty much have an idea of what you want to do. Go and do what you want to do. So I found the first person that was crazy enough to give up her very good job. Her name was Maryam. And we started just going to prison and looking for people that needed help, especially with the death penalty. And that's how we started. And within 2 months, we'd gotten a fellowship. And within 4 months, we had another funder. And so to us, that was like a lot of money back then for us. Yeah. And then we just got a bunch of law students to come and help us, and that's how it started.
I think that's a very, very interesting story, and I think that's a story for people who are trying to figure out what they really want to do in their career. You're one of those people who figured it out really early.
Wow. No, I was very late. It was like around 30. I think I'm probably one of the oldest lawyers that went to law school late. And I get this question a lot, by the way, what is it that, how do you know what you're meant to do? And I really struggled with that my entire life until I found this job. And I think there's so many things that you can do or you want to do or you're interested in. But for me, what I suggest is whatever the issue is that makes you literally get out of bed and you're so enraged by it that it motivates you to try to solve it, that's your issue. Stick with it. And if that's the problem that you try to solve, you will figure it out. The first time I went to death row, I'd never seen it. And just going there, and that was my first time inside of a prison as well, and seeing hundreds of people just locked up, and I was there to see my first ever client, Zulfikar, and because I was dressed as a lawyer, and all the others could tell that I was a lawyer, even though I was a woman lawyer, and half of them were like, what is she doing here? But the fact that I was a lawyer and I was meeting somebody whose even his Supreme Court appeal had been cancelled, so it was a part of death row that no lawyers come to. And I sat there with him and I talked to him for so long that all of the other prisoners started yelling out my name. And I had to kind of step aside. I pretended I needed to go to the bathroom so the warden could take me outside. And I remember going outside and I was so overwhelmed. I didn't want to cry in front of the warden, but it was such an overwhelming feeling. And I remember looking up, well, to the left, and then suddenly there was like the gallows right there. And it was just, I'll never forget that feeling in my entire life. Like you can feel death. You can feel, there's like a heaviness in that air. It's silent and there's a heaviness in that air. And then I just remember looking up being like, I had tears coming down my face because I just didn't know what I was supposed to do with this, right? There were 600 people in just that ward alone. And I'm like a year and a half, 2 years out of law school, and what the hell am I supposed to do with this? But I think I also just knew that was it. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to do it. But I knew that I couldn't live with myself if I ever walked away from it. And so that's how it began. So when young people ask me, what is it that they want to do? Or what is the cause that really moves them? For me, it's like, pick the things that makes you not just tweet,
right?
But it really makes you get out there to start, like, to make that difference. And you learn across the way. And, people will come into your life. If you set out to do good, the universe just kind of brings the right people into your life that enable you and empower you to do that. And in Pakistan, where there's such little red tape, you can really make a difference.
Just hearing about there being 600 prisoners in one single ward and all of them, majority of them not having representation or not having adequate representation to actually get their cases moving, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's in those times, like, it wasn't very common for lawyers to go and visit the prison to meet with their clients. Lawyers would only meet with their clients, while the trial was going ahead. So they'd see them at the courthouse. At the time of the appeal, they never went to see their clients. It didn't matter. They would just read the case file and stuff. And so I think now things are quite different. I see a lot of young lawyers regularly going and visiting their clients. You cannot know what is the case or what your defense is if you do not build a relationship with your client, right? You only know this much of the case. So I think that's changing now in a good way.
I'm glad to hear that. I think everyone is glad to hear that, and we've definitely seen more women lawyers come into the field as well.
Yeah, criminal law as well, especially criminal law, which is really important.
Because previously we were just working mainly on family law, but I think a lot of them have stepped into criminal law. And you do such vast variety of work that packing that within a 45-minute conversation is sort of going to be an impossible task. But there are two areas that I definitely want to pick up from what you've mentioned. I know that you work with juveniles. I know that you work with mentally ill. You work with marginalized communities. And then we have a problem of overpopulation within our prisons generally. And then that overpopulation is due to people being behind bars while being under trial for petty crimes. And then a lot of that population is juveniles and the mentally ill. Legally, juveniles should not be in prisons. What can be done to actually
fix this? So, just to be clear, at Justice Project Pakistan, one of the reasons that we've been, I would say, pretty good at our jobs is because we've always stuck to the issue that we set out to solve, which is a pretty big problem, which is Pakistan's use of the death penalty, right? And trying to bring that in line with international law. The problems that you have articulated are actually subsets to our work on the death penalty, right? So I'm not the child rights expert, but children who are on death row and getting them off of death row is something that JPP has worked on, right? We pivoted to being a prison reform organization, essentially, when COVID happened. Because, death row is the most restricted part of the prison itself. It's a prison within the prison. And we were absolutely terrified of what that was going to do to our clients who were alive. So I think I know a lot of other organizations in the region who also pivoted to doing prison reform work. We used the same during COVID. And at that time, when the information wasn't coming out, it was coming out sporadically. I'm talking about like March 2020, right?
Right, the onset of.
Exactly. So we knew that the governments and the provincial authorities were going to be, were going to be overwhelmed. And so we kind of really took it upon ourselves to start gathering all of the guidances that were coming out from the World Health Organization, all of, mapping what was happening and how other countries were dealing with their prison populations, what were the mitigation strategies, and, basically kind of condensing it for the prison authorities as a cheat sheet for them to use. And I have to say, in Pakistan, we avoided a disaster. And that was partly, we got lucky, but they actually even took steps. And I'm not talking about just the federal government, I'm talking about the provincial government separately, right? They were pretty proactive, and they did make the right calls to some extent, and that prevented a huge disaster from taking place. But it also kind of opened the door for something very, that, prison reform advocates knew forever. But I think it was harder to get policymakers and prison and bureaucrats and parliamentarians to understand this, which is that our prisons are full of not the most dangerous people that pose any risk to society. They're full of, unconvicted people, and they're full of people that have been accused for petty crimes and are essentially there because of poverty, right? So during COVID, there was the Supreme Court so the provinces had decided, for one of the only times that I remember in history, exercising this long-standing power that they've had, where the provincial government can actually pardon, commute, or remit sentences to any extent. And they actually were going to use that power to empty out the prisons, to reduce overcrowding so that COVID doesn't spread. And the provinces started taking that initiative themselves. And unfortunately, there was a suo motu case taken by the Supreme Court, and they started to see it. And unfortunately, that had a bit of a chilling effect. However, what the court was able to order, we filed our representations before the court as well, and they formulated guidelines presented by the Attorney General based on the research that we had provided, of which prisoners were eligible for early release based on that power. Right. And so it was juveniles, women, people who had less than X number left on their sentences, terminally ill, these kind of people were, so that was ordered. Unfortunately, because of the chilling effect of, initially, it didn't pan out the way it could. But what it does show is that policymakers and government officials do realize that their prisons are, not full of the most dangerous people, and that these people have no business being in jail. I mean, we're starting a program. It's called the decriminalization of poverty. Too often we talk about overcrowding, and still, unfortunately, in some provinces like Punjab, which has the largest prison population by far, every time that I've been in a meeting with, or sitting in on a meeting with the Punjab government, the solution is always like, we're building 10 more prisons. Do you know how much money it costs to build prisons? That is an absolutely futile exercise at all. Absolutely. The focus should instead be on releasing on conditional bail, or all these laws that we already have, not having these people in prison.
Developing parole mechanisms, actually.
We have a parole and board, and we have a parole, we have the Probation and Parole Act, and we have the Probation and Parole Authority as well, right? They need to be empowered. They're like the stepsisters of the stepmothers or the second wife, I don't know what to call them, of, this entire system. And the third thing is that all of these conversations always take place without the judiciary there. And they're the ones who are like sending people to prison. And I'm not talking about just high court, right? Like the magistrates need to be trained on this. The prosecutors need to be trained on this together. The third thing we also noticed in terms of our work around prison reform was that during COVID, and this is also a part of the decriminalization of poverty campaign, we saw that the police, on our advice, like we had mentioned to them, that one of the things you need to do to reduce the number of people is that there was an average of, I think, 500 people per day coming in and out of prisons, right, in Punjab prisons per day. That's like 1,500 people. So, our suggestion was slow the churn. So stop arresting people for smaller petty offenses like vagrancy laws, or send them to mental hospitals instead, which again, we have a mental health act that allows the police to place somebody on an involuntary hold. Stop arresting people, for petty crimes, for sex trafficking, not sex trafficking, but sex work, all this kind of stuff. And we didn't
flying.
Exactly. And we didn't know actually that if they did that or not. And we found out, we happened to be sitting on another government meeting 2 years later. And, they were very proudly saying that they actually had managed to stop arrests, slow it down. So they can do this, right? And the silver lining on this is that, with data, I think policymakers can be much, much more convinced of this. And we're very hopeful with the launch of our decriminalization of poverty program that there needs to be legislative change in the sense, not adding legislation, striking off these colonial era laws that essentially punish poverty, identifying the vulnerable populations of people that should not be in prison, right? And bail reform, of course, but bail reform here also means training magistrates and those, the Supreme Court has given guidelines ad nauseum, to, all kinds of stuff, but they're not being enforced at the magistrates level. So that needs to be much more strictly done. And my big thing always is that I know the judiciary doesn't like to sit, or they think that they're interfering to some extent. But that is an outdated way of thinking. I know many Superior Court justices that are much, much more open to sitting down with prosecutors, with officers, to actually talk about how are we going to solve this.
I think this also sort of brings me automatically to my next question that I sort of wanted to ask you and actually learn from you was your work around the death penalty. Because from what I've learned, you and JPP is not particularly raising a voice for abolishment of the death penalty. Rather, you're working on ensuring that less number of crimes are punishable by death penalty, because if I'm not wrong, there's around 31 crimes right now that are punishable by the death penalty. So now it's 32 crimes that are punishable by the death penalty, and then we don't follow the international guidelines for the death penalty either. So and then there's a lot of things involved, like the presidential pardon and then the mercy plea, etc. So for our sake and for the sake of our viewers who are listening to you today to sort of understand this, how does this entire mechanism work? How does the mercy plea come in? Why does the death penalty need to be abolished or need to be regulated?
So I always talk about the death penalty. It's for every country in the world. The history, their journey to abolition is their own particular journey, right? But we can learn from the journeys of other countries as well, right? So I will only talk about the death penalty in the context of Pakistan as a Pakistani, and as a Pakistani lawyer that practices in Pakistan. The international legal standard, international law does not. It does allow for the death penalty. It does not ban the death penalty as yet. I'm pretty sure it's going to move there in a couple of years, but not yet. Under international law, if a country like the United States or Pakistan or Singapore is going to have the death penalty as a punishment, then it has very strict legal standards that must be followed to ensure that none of the other human rights are violated in the imposition of the death penalty. So the more severe the punishment that you're going to give, the higher the standards for getting it right and due process are. So what are some of the standards? The number one standard is that you can only prescribe the death penalty for the most serious crimes. Now, what qualifies as the most serious crimes is crimes of intentional killing. Right. So not that I crashed my car into you and I killed you by mistake, or not that I was having a fight with you and it turned into a violent fight and then you died. Right? It has to be like a premeditative, intentional crime of killing. Yeah. And broadly speaking, Pakistan only executes people for murder and terrorism. Primarily. So we actually, practically speaking, Pakistan only executes for crimes that match the most serious crimes threshold in international law. However, we've got like up until a few years back, we've had 33 crimes.
I think there was something related to the railways as well. Which
Yes, so that one is gone now, finally. I mean, that was around from the Brits' time. So, there's no reason for us, when practically speaking, we are only executing for 2 crimes, for us to have 33 crimes on the books. It does not benefit us. It's not utilitarian. It doesn't hurt us. For those who like to kill, you still get to kill as many people as you want. In the sense, like from the government, if you like to execute, it's not taking anything away from you. But what you are doing is being a much more responsible member of the global community that gets you more respect by making sure that, you don't have 33 crimes on the books. We also did this research that showed, we analyzed every single capital crime in Pakistan and its history of convictions. And what we found was that, in cases like gang rape, for example, having somebody punished to death, having gang rape punishable by death was actually lowering the convictions of people. Because judges happen to be men, they don't like the idea, this is an inherent bias, that 5 boys would lose their life for this. It seems like an immense loss of life to a man that's sitting there. So, they would convict one maybe and acquit the others. Whereas if you actually change that to life imprisonment, that's an easier thing for the judge, who's a man, to do, right? Same with child sexual abuse. If you listen to the child rights activists, this is not me as a death penalty activist saying this, these are child rights activists, right? They say they fight against it, not because they're anti-death penalty people. They fight against it because it says it makes it much more likely that the child will be killed, because he should identify who's been abusing him. Number 2, child sexual abuse, and I think the stat is over 70%, happens by somebody who's a close family member.
So you're within your immediate circle is the family.
Absolutely. So you're not going to do this to the family. So, there are very practical reasons for why we should not have the death penalty. I mean, if you're sitting at home and you're a huge proponent of it, and you have a bloodlust to see somebody punished, maybe go watch a really violent movie. Like, fair enough. You know what I mean? But you're not, if you're saying that you want to protect children and you want to prevent child sexual abuse, this is not working. Look at the stats, look at the people that are experts in this, the child rights people, listen to what they're saying on what are the techniques to present it. So, lastly speaking, that was one of the most serious.
But what do you do about the public outcry? Because every single time there is a case of there's an unfortunate case of gang rape, or there is an unfortunate case of child abuse, there's a public outcry for not just execution, for public hangings.
Yeah, so that was gotten rid of by our Supreme Court many years ago, right? So that's actually it violates human dignity. That's been ruled against the Constitution. When there was a public hanging, debate, the Senate called for technical assistance from the Council of Islamic Ideology. They had all of the IGs of all the prisons present. Every single one of them said, don't do it. It creates an unsafe situation. I'm not saying like the prison department doesn't like to kill. I'm sure there's some people in there who really like to kill. They said, don't do it. It will create a situation. It actually harms the public as well. And the data that we presented was countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran love executing. They've been like the top 5, top 3 executioners for the last many years. They have public hangings. वो भी थक गए हैं.
They've also
नहीं वो थक गए हैं. Iran is now scaling back its drug laws, because if it was such a big deterrent, then why is Iran executing it? Well, before it's gone nuts on another level, right. It was executing hanging people for drug offenses, and they were leaving their bodies hanging for ages. About 800, they were averaging 800 executions a year. Drug crimes were not reducing. Who the hell were they hanging? Same with Saudi Arabia. People like to think that there's no crime. Saudi Arabia is one of the top executioners in the world.
Yes.
Who are they executing? And by the way, if somebody says foreign nationals, I'm really going to lose it, because that's just a very racist thing to say. Saudis are getting executed, right?
Yeah.
So look at the data. And to your public outcry point, look, even in our own religion, even in Islam, right? When the Prophet came, this process of, what is it called? Qisas, right? It was already there in the tribal culture, right? Like, I take your life, your family has a right to take my life. But when the Prophet came, he said, that's fine. I take your life, your family can take my life, but your family will not kill me, right? The state will come in and they will carry out the punishment, because you are going to be too emotional and you have to be absolutely exact, and you cannot take an eye for an eye meant an eye for an eye, not an eye and an arm and a blah, 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 right? So there is a neutral arbitrator, right? That is the role of the state. The public sentiment sometimes is also inflamed by the state, right?
That's what I was hinting at, because a lot of our legislation also happens when there is a public outcry.
And that's wrong, in the sense that,
it shouldn't be reactive.
Well, the public and everybody else can be reactive, right? But the role of our criminal justice system and the state is to do what's right by all of the citizens. And that does not, and you saw that take place in the Senate debate with people with technical people who prevailed and were sensible. And they said, look, this is not going to help in any way, shape or form, right? Finally, to your point of, what Islam also says, there's a very beautiful, by the way, the Quranic Standard for the death penalty. There's only 2 crimes that are mentioned in the Quran for which the death penalty can be given, and that's murder and fasad fil ard. It matches the international human rights standard, right? And for all of those crimes, mercy is allowed.
Right.
Is actually preferred, right? And our constitution also has mercy. So another thing that international law also requires is that everybody who's been sentenced to death has a right to seek mercy, and it has the procedure by which they seek mercy has to be meaningful. It can't just be a
tick box.
Right. So it has to meet due process standards, and it has to be a meaningful review. Now, our president, like most countries in the world, does have the power to grant mercy. Our Supreme Court has written just beautiful judgments on the powers and almost unfettered powers of the president to grant mercy. But there's been no instance, except I think one in recent years, in which, maybe 1 or 2, but in recent years only one, in which President Musharraf granted mercy to a British national on death row at the request of Prince Charles. Everybody else, people who are mentally ill, people who are juveniles, people who are wrongfully sentenced, their mercy petitions are not being meaningfully considered. A few years ago, there was a movement by the Ministry of Human Rights to reform the mercy petitions procedure to the extent that there would be a provincial committee, and then it will get reviewed by the Ministry of Human Rights as well as the Interior Ministry before giving recommendations to the President. Unfortunately, the rules that were issued under it, the committees were formed, which is a great idea, but the rules have never been issued under it, and it's not saved the problem. It still makes it bad. So we're like halfway there, and now the focus has been gone, but we're really hoping that those rules, and the rules that I've had a sneak peek at the rules there with the Ministry of Law right now. They're really, really good. They're really fair. They're very good. They're in line with Islamic principles. So that's one of our main kind of priorities for this year going forward, is that we hope that the government will pass those rules. I mean, they don't even need to be a part of, they're rules. They don't need to be an act of parliament. I mean, the previous government had actually put their own version of the rules as an act in the criminal reform bill. But then the assembly's dissolved. Yeah. So now I hope the law ministry will take the lead on this and get this done.
When you talk about death penalty, and then you talk about life sentence to imprisonment as well, I think another thing that you definitely cannot when you talk about prisons in Pakistan, death penalty, the third area that you cannot forgo is torture. And I know that JPP has been working on, we decided we will not be calling it the anti-torture bill, we will be calling it the anti-custodial torture bill. If I can ask you to elaborate a little bit on that, the current situation in our provinces. I know that you've done a few studies to see what the current prevalent situation is, and if you think that this bill will actually be a good deterrent to that or not.
So, I mean, it's a huge win for Pakistan that we did pass the bill, right? It was one of the biggest recommendations of the Committee Against Torture. It goes really well with our compliance with human rights standards. It really actually impressed the international community, and it made us look really good. Plus, it was long overdue, right? This is for our own citizens. We're extremely happy and proud that the bill was passed. It was a really big deal. It has a couple of shortcomings, but as a first go, we'll take it. It's a pretty decent bill. And it has our work on torture began when we were doing trial work defending, people on the death penalty, was that most of them, including some witnesses on the basis of whose, testimony our clients were convicted, were tortured. Right. So, I mean, torture absolutely corrupts the entire criminal justice system, right? The sanctity, look, I don't believe in the death penalty. Somebody else might. But we both at least would want the right person to get convicted, right? If you torture me, I'll tell you I'm a goat. I'll tell you I'm the Sipai Sahaba. I'll tell you whatever you need me to say. So it doesn't necessarily, you're not getting the right person, right? Got it. There's a really good story. It's not a good, it actually happened. Actually, it was Azam Saab that used to tell me this, that there was a case, so this must be in the mid-2000s, where there were two boys that had gone missing, then were presumed dead. They rounded up people in the village. They got two of the men confessed to the torture. The trial began for the murder of those boys. They testified, they said, yes, we did it, and the boy came back. Right? And those guys were a month away from being sentenced. And this is what torture does.
I think that paints a picture of what torture can actually.
Yeah, and this bill is a really decent bill. And there's been a lot of torture today being talked about. Of journalists, of human rights defenders, of parliamentarians, of you name who, right? My pet peeve to all of them is that there is a law. That law will only work and get implemented if you use the law. Please study the law and kick it into action. I'm sure that because of, torture is political, the law is political.
Right.
But in order to make it effective, you have to use it. Tweeting about it is not going to change.
All right.
Right? You have the National Commission that has oversight. You have the FIA that's supposed to investigate. I don't like that bit. I don't like cops investigating cops. But we have to begin somewhere. Right? So use the law. When the law fails, then you go to court. And then the court will be even more stricter about it. The same goes with reaching out to international human rights organizations. Tweeting up to them doesn't work, right? They have a procedure.
And that has to be followed.
For filing an allegation letter. They will reach out to the country and they will ask the country what they have done. And that process, the country will be asked again and again and again and again. We have a CAT review coming up, a Committee Against Torture. If you do not do these things, you do not compile that evidence, you do not file it in the right place, you will not fix it. Do you know what I mean? And it's not a naive way to say. For example, I met this journalist the other day. It was in January. And he was very nice, and we were doing the screening on the UPR. And, he came and he said, the torture of journalists. And, आपको नहीं लगता कि हालात ज़्यादा बुरे हो रहे हैं और देखिए जर्नलिस्ट के साथ क्या हो रहा है. And I said, मेरी बात सुने, एक तो हमारी तारीख में हालात हमारे कभी ठीक नहीं हुए,
Information has been more.
हमेशा इसी तरह ही हुआ। तो ये कहना कि आज ज़्यादा बुरे हैं कल पहले था, आप अयूब के ज़माने वालों से पूछ लें या उससे पहले वालों से पूछ लें या मुशर्रफ के ज़माने, सारे यही आपको कहेंगे। I'm not making a comment on that. I'm not equating it all. I'm just saying that you have more tools to use than you had previously. So, उनसे क्या फ़र्क पड़ता है, चीफ जस्टिस से इस्तदा करें तो क्या? I said चीफ जस्टिस में जब आपने केस फाइल किया नहीं, हमने उनको ट्वीट किया कि हमारी मदद करें, सो मोटो लें। क्यों? खुदा के वास्ते क्यों लें? आप जाके UN एजेंसीज ने कुछ नहीं किया। मैंने कहा जी आपने उनका एलिगेशन लेटर लिखा? नहीं, हमने उनको ट्वीट किया। मैंने कहा जी ये तो यही बात हुई ना, आपको ये आप कहेंगे जी मुझे ट्रेनिंग दे, एंड आई नो फॉर अ फैक्ट कि जर्नलिस्ट की ट्रेनिंग हुई है ऑन एलिगेशन लेटर्स लिखने की। मैंने कहा जी आप हमारे पास आ जाए, हम आपको 10 दफ़ा सिखाएंगे कि जी एलिगेशन लेटर किस तरह लिखते हैं। मैंने कहा आप NCHR के पास गए, नेशनल कमीशन के साथ, वो क्या करेंगे? उनका मैंडेट है, वो करेंगे। सो आई सेड आप UPR वाली जो हमारी स्क्रीनिंग है उसके ऊपर आए। नहीं, वो ज़रा मैं बिजी था। मैंने कहा फिर आप सीख नहीं सकते। आप देखते कि कितने ममालिक ने पाकिस्तान से जर्नलिस्ट की ट्रीटमेंट के ऊपर सवाल पूछा है, राइट? सो आई मीन दिस जनरल थिंग ऑफ
seeking justice through Twitter is
it's insane. I'm sorry, it's absolutely insane. That's like me saying कि I want my driver's license or my ID card, but I refuse to go to Nadra or fill out the paperwork. I will tweet about it.
I wish it was that
Give it
easy
to me
to
like that. I mean, what are we talking about? Right? The system can only work and improve when you kickstart it. And yes, there is political bias. There's God knows what bias. That's what a poor person deals with on a daily basis, by the way. But you overcome it when powerful people try to do that and the system fails. You can actually correct it. You know? So please, for the love of God, use the law.
I think the other question that I will ask you on this is, when you talk about prisons, you talk about the justice sector, there's no way you can't talk about police reforms. Do you think this bill will also be the precursor for a lot of police reforms that are needed, particularly, again, around custodial torture, around arresting for petty crimes, etc.? Do you think this law will kickstart the much needed process of police reforms? And the reason I say kickstart the process is because we've been in a conversation of police reforms since the country gained independence, but there has been only very little meaningful reform.
I mean, look, the reason for that is twofold, but this is a controversial view. So, I mean, look, there's been so much, there's been so much money that has been pooled in with good intention on capacity building the police. And you know, a lot of it, some of it has succeeded. And, you know, like a lot of the gender sensitive training, getting more women into the police force, that stuff, yes. But you know, you're not going to have training or capacity building without accountability. मैं अपनी community को देख लूँ, lawyers, right? They went mad after the lawyers movement. There's zero accountability for them. Any idara that has zero accountability will go nuts. So yes, I think this bill is an important first step,
Right.
To hold, and it's not just the police, it's public servants. Right? To hold them accountable. But it can only work if lawyers and everybody, you know, start using it and understanding it and knowing how to do it. The second thing is that, you know, I also think that it's going to, it will have a positive impact on police reforms. For example, we just got told by the National Commission that, you know, the Punjab police, or was it the Faisalabad police, have now made an entire module, or totally on their own, we had nothing to do with this. They've made an entire training module on torture, and you know, the National Commission and us are going to go and actually train them on it.
I mean,
it's a very good start. It's a very good start, but I think that there still needs to be accountability, right? So, you know, there's this kind of accountability, which is through the courts. But I think police officers themselves, and most importantly, donors, right? Big donors. And almost every big donor in Pakistan funds police reform work over capacity building the police in Pakistan. Please, it is very easy to know reward the police stations that are doing better. Torture can be your one marker for determining it, because you have medical legal certificates that are given by a board appointed by the government to investigate claims of torture. If you just go in and keep looking at those and seeing ke kis thane ke, which police station has decreased the number of verified complaints, make sure you give them more capacity. Well, as in give them more resources to do their job. Reward them. Give it a prize. No torture prize. And for the ones that are struggling and they're not improving, they need more capacity building.
I think that's a lot that we've tried to unpack in a 45-minute conversation, but I want to come back full circle, and I want to take a few minutes and actually ask you, what happened with the first case that you were dealing with for the death penalty? I believe Zulfikar was the name that you mentioned.
So we actually were able to get him a stay of execution, but that was because it was 2007 or 8, and it was President Zardari had just started giving stays of execution. So those started happening, I think, within a month of us getting the case. So we went and we got the stay for him, but then pretty soon, the stays started coming. So he stayed alive on death row for many years. He actually had educated over 600 prisoners at Radiala. We had hundreds of prisoners write on his behalf, people who had left prison and stuff, and saying that they used to call him Dr. Saab in prison. They said, this man changed our life. We went into prison completely bereft. We would have still been in prison if it wasn't for this man. So he was incredibly revered. But unfortunately, because of the mercy petitions procedure, when they lifted the moratorium, he was one of the ones whose dates came up. Execution date was fixed, and we stopped it once. But then a month and a half later, he was executed.
I'm sorry. Sad to hear that. But I think that sort of just indicates how much work still needs to be done. And
he was just really poor, and it was just wrong, and he had given so much back. And if we had just... this whole mercy petitions procedure. I went to the Ministry of Interior once. I was looking to meet some joint secretary or something, and I happened to be sitting in a room where, this is at the height of when they lifted the moratorium, there's just a room full of files. And this one guy was just signing off the files quickly. And, he didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who he was. We were just striking up a conversation, and these were piles of the mercy petitions. And he was proudly proclaiming how he had signed off 30 files. He wasn't even opening them. This is a constitutional right of every citizen of Pakistan. This is someone's life, right? He should have lived. And what really angered me was the day after, every newspaper carried his obituary of what an educationist, what a this, what a that. And I just feel really angry and bitter about it because he should have been alive.
He definitely should have been alive today, but I really do hope that the work that you're doing and the direction in which that work is headed, we will see less Zulfikars getting executed as your work.
Yeah, he's the reason I do this. So he changed my life. And I guess he was, because of us at JPP, we've managed to save quite a few. So let's see how far it goes.
Thank you so much for taking out the time. Thank you so much for sharing such a difficult story of yours. And thank you for everything we've learned from you today.
Thank you so much for having me.